everyone. My name is Nora Zaki, and I'm a student chaplain and intern here at AIC. I go to University of Chicago. I'm doing my Master's of Divinity, and I'm very pleased and honored to welcome our guest, who's also from U Chicago. Before we begin, I just wanted to remind you that we like social media here. So if you guys are tweeters, or you can hashtag AIC lecture. And a few other housekeeping items. You guys can keep getting food. The bathrooms are on your left. And there's actually we have an open house coming up this Saturday, and we also have a Muslim orchestra coming up on the 21st. Now I'll introduce our speaker. Dr. Cynthia Shawamreh has been teaching courses at U Chicago's Law School since 2008. She is an affiliate faculty member of U Chicago Center for Middle Eastern Studies. Her courses taught have included Islamic law and finance, introduction to Islamic law, and law, politics, economics, and the making of the modern Middle East. Maybe if we all took that, we could solve some of the problems over there. She lectures on law and Islamic finance internationally as well. She has spoken on topics of dispute resolution, Islamic law in the modern Moroccan context, and even lectured in Italy about Islamic finance. She's in fact working with the Italian Association of Financial Advisors in structuring a possible sovereign sukuk offering for the Italian government. Sukuk is Sharia-compliant bonds, in case you don't know what that is. She has contributed a chapter title called The Legal Framework of Islamic Finance in the book Contemporary Islamic Finance, Innovations, Applications, and Best Practices. Cynthia actually also practices law as a senior counsel for the city of Chicago, and she's anticipated to lead a group of U Chicago law students to the UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain this December in a legal immersion program. Her legal practice and research interests center on sustainable and ethical development in the global economy. And before I introduce her, I wanted to say that one of our professors here, Dr. Awas, will be offering a week course on contemporary Islamic commercial law and ethics theory and application. So, inshallah, God willing, you guys will benefit from her course and her lecture, and perhaps if you take his in the future. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Cynthia Shawamreh. Thank you.
Thank you. It's absolutely a pleasure and an honor to have been invited here. I'm delighted to speak to you about modern Islamic finance, basic principles and practice. So this is, of course, the question of Islamic finance and what the rules are in the Sharia governing commercial transactions. But what we're looking at today is something known as the modern Islamic finance industry, okay? So this industry has really started to become very significant financially in the global economy since around the 1970s. In the last few years, you can see that Deutsche Bank has estimated the value of the industry at over $1 trillion, almost $2 trillion. Standard & Poor's, Ernst & Young. These are typical conventional organizations that are looking at and monitoring the competitiveness of the Islamic finance industry. So you're talking about, again, about almost $2 trillion worth of assets. There has also been, in recent years, a crossover from the Islamic finance industry into the mainstream global economy in ways that have been illustrated by seeing participants that are not Muslims taking advantage of the opportunities presented through these Sharia-compliant structuring vehicles. And we're talking about a lot of money. So, for example, the United Kingdom just last year issued a sukuk for £200 million, South Africa for $500 million US dollars, Hong Kong's sukuk was for $1 billion, okay? Just in 1 year we're talking about. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is to really try and get a very basic, very brief overview of the basic rules and principles of Islamic finance as it is understood in the modern industry, okay? The current trends in that industry, and some of the challenges of dual regulatory systems. And what I mean by that is that these are transactions that must be Sharia compliant, okay, and the question then of who determines that. There are certain Sharia scholars that are very well versed in these issues who will give fatwas as to whether or not a particular financing structure is or is not Sharia compliant. That's a component of each of these transactions. And then in addition to Sharia compliance, these transactions also need to comply with local law. And of course, local law is very diverse, and this industry is truly global. So if you are issuing a sukuk in the UK, you must comply with UK law, right? If you're issuing a sukuk in Bahrain, you must comply with Bahraini law, in addition to being Sharia compliant. So what are the principles that underlie this industry? And they really come down to a few basic concepts. I think probably most importantly is the prohibition of riba. And feel free to ask questions if you'd like, you're welcome to do that. Riba, does anybody know what that is? Or want to throw something out there?
Interest.
A lot of people interpret that word, riba, as interest. But interest is a part of riba, not all of riba. So Wardeh, Ibrahim Wardeh, who's written on this, and I like his work very much, defines riba instead as an unjustified increase, okay? An unjustified increase. So, of course, in Islam, there's no question that profit is acceptable. Increasing your money, there's clear text about that. But what is the line between making a justified profit for your business ventures and making an unjustified profit or increase? And so interest, riba jahaliya, is one example, okay, of riba, where there was a pre-Islamic practice that involved, you would loan money, the debt would come due, the person would be unable to pay, and you would double it, right? And so then if the debt came due again, it would be redoubled if you couldn't pay again. And so there is text that explicitly prohibits this practice. So there's no question that that's unacceptable riba. Interest generally, the vast majority of scholars would say that is riba. A few would disagree with that in the modern world, okay? But the process of defining what is and what is not riba is something that keeps Muslim scholars, busy, right? Is a collateralized debt obligation riba, or is it not riba? That's something that requires engaging with the texts and making interpretations, okay? So that's riba, prohibited. Everybody agrees it's prohibited. People do not agree on what exactly it is, okay? Gharar is the next basic prohibition. And gharar is the idea of uncertainty that is excessive. So excessive uncertainty. Okay? There is a different word for gambling, maisir, which is of course prohibited. But gharar is any unjust, excessive uncertainty. So speculation, things like that. So my favorite text to explain what gharar is, that really helped me get my mind around that idea, was the hadith that says, "Do not buy fish in the sea, for it is gharar." Okay? So, for example, I can go fishing, I can gather up a bunch of fish, I can take them to the market, and I can sell them. No problem. And I can sell them for a profit, right? What I can't do is sell you whatever it is I'm going to catch today, because I might not catch anything, right? Does that make sense? Right? So that's an example of gharar. Yeah?
So gharar includes stocks and shares also?
No. It doesn't, but it could if you, this is again the question of engaging with the texts and having people who are skilled and knowledgeable, who are Sharia scholars, not academics like me, scholars, who are looking at text, who are looking at commentary, who are looking at interpretations through their school, whichever it happens to be, Maliki, Shafi, Hanbali, Hanafi, and deciding which of these products in the modern financial context is going against gharar and which isn't. A good example of where the schools disagree would be something like, you know, what about nuts? Nuts in the shell. Can you sell those? Because you don't know actually what's going to be inside, right? One school says yes, one school says no. What about carrots that are under the ground? And you haven't pulled them up yet, so you don't really know. One school says yes, one school says no. So those are the things that are included in the Qarar and that scholars must wrestle with as they engage with the text. Of course, the modern Islamic finance industry, you're only talking about halal activities. Of course, you can't have a business selling pork or selling alcohol and so on. And underlying the whole idea of the modern Islamic finance industry is the idea that this is really about the quest for justice and an ethical society. Okay?
Cynthia?
Yes.
I'm sorry, if you could go back just a little bit. Do any of the scholars define what interest is? Not rebut, but what interest is?
Define what interest is?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can we just hold the questions till after the lecture? Then
Sure.
it goes a lot smoother. Everybody could hear and sort of benefit. So I don't want
Okay.
to interrupt.
That's
Sheet colored has to be interactive, that's why I asked.
Yep, no, he overrules that, so I'm fine with that.
Everybody gets to sort of hear the questions.
And you're right, I have a short period of time to talk to you, and then we can discuss and engage as much as you like after that. Okay, so a few other principles that I wanted to bring your attention to is this idea of profit and loss sharing. This is a very important idea in the Islamic finance industry, that you should be taking risks together. This is one of the reasons why, you know, just conventional bank lending, where the bank takes no risk of loss and all the risk of loss is on the individual, you know, that's problematic. There should be shared risk, okay? And again, I just talked about excessive risk, right, or excessive uncertainty being prohibited, but you have to have some risk in order to justify your increase, in order to justify your profits, okay? So these principles link finance to the real economy. Like, you should be trading in real things, right? Trade is good in the text, but to trade, you know, on speculative, you know, slices of an interest that doesn't really exist, you know, it's kind of like a bubble on top of the economy. What the Islamic texts require is that what you're trading in is real, you know, that you're actually producing things that you are trading. Okay, and of course, you're trying to, in Islamic finance, promote economic and social development through your business practices, ethical business practices that, you know, include being trustworthy and honoring your obligations and so on, and through zakat, charitable giving. And so one of the most important distinguishing features in Islamic finance is that, unlike conventional finance, it's not driven by profit maximization alone, okay? So making a profit is okay, but that can't be the only purpose in your business activities, okay? So just very briefly, again, what we're talking about that's a $1.8 trillion industry today is something very modern, okay? And really, Warde actually divides the modern period into 3 different stages, which I think is useful and helpful. There were some early experiments in the late 60s, a social bank in a small village in Egypt, actually Mithqamar, where there was, you know, sort of experimentation with lending and trying to help farmers without interest and so on. There was also an experiment in Malaysia for helping people collect funds to finance their pilgrimages in ways that were not using interest. But then in the 70s, this really started to develop. And why? I'm kind of looking puzzled, you know, why would that be? That was because of the windfall of profits related to oil, okay? So suddenly there's all of this money, and there's the ability to experiment with it without going, you know, bankrupt, right? So you had a couple of Saudi individuals who were very pious and very interested in pioneering this industry. So Salah Kamal is one, Prince Mohammed Faisal was another. And they created these banks, not in Saudi Arabia, but they created, these groups, these financial groups that started pioneering the different types of structures and had enough funding to really get this industry off the ground. So that was that early period. And then you had the first Gulf War, right? And things started to shift a little bit. One of the sort of highlights of that period was in the economy, the global economy, it was a time of free market ideology, right? So the Washington Consensus, if that's something that you're familiar with, really this Washington Consensus kind of spread all over the world through groups like, the IMF, the World Bank, and so on, and started demanding these free market ideals being implemented around the world. And one of the side effects of that was that these sort of unusual or alternative financing structures found a place, right? There had been, prior to that period, really a very strict division between investing and banking, where you just lend money, get money back in. And so this allowed for the flourishing of this sort of niche industry that could experiment over time. And that period saw a lot of diversity. Okay, so that you had people in Malaysia in this industry coming up with products that people in the Gulf thought were not Sharia compliant at all. There was a lot of differences of opinion about what was pushing the envelope too far and what was, within a Sharia compliant framework. Okay, after 2001, there was, of course, a rise of Islamophobia in the West. One of the impacts of that was that the money then started to come back into predominantly Muslim countries. And okay, you don't want our money in the West, fine, we'll take it and we'll invest it locally. And so that was a big boost for the Islamic finance industry after 2001. Another thing that was notable about that period was a converging of the different strains of Islamic finance. It started to streamline people. There were organizations that started cooperating, like IOFI and IFSB and so on, that were, you would see conferences in Malaysia where scholars from the Gulf were invited to attend, and so that you started having more consensus around things. And that's the period that we're in now. I would say that in the last couple of years, the big trend has been crossing over into mainstream conventional finance, so that now that there's real money in it, Goldman Sachs and HSBC and these big banks and so on want to participate in the industry, not from any desire to be Sharia compliant, but simply to access the liquidity in the Gulf and in Malaysia and other places. So again, to get a perspective of what is this industry, who's in this, what you have is really these different categories of people that are part of the industry. And the first group is the Islamic finance practitioners. These are Muslims who are trying to find ways to practice their financial businesses that are in ways that they consider to be Sharia compliant. And of course you have Sharia scholars who have to engage with the texts and determine whether or not those Sharia compliant structures are in fact Sharia compliant. So virtually every Islamic financial institution either has a Sharia board of people who consult on whether or not the products that they're offering to the market are in fact Sharia compliant, or you have fatwas that are issued for, we just talked about $1 billion sukuk, right, from Hong Kong. Who's to say whether that's Sharia compliant or not? In order to issue that in the market, you'd have maybe 3 different Sharia scholars signing off on the structure before that would be sold. And then you have lawyers, right, who tend to be Western trained lawyers. This is a very remarkable part of this industry, in my opinion. You have people who may or may not be Muslims, who work for large law firms in the UK or in the United States. that have branch offices in Malaysia or in the Gulf. London has announced its intention to be a hub for Islamic finance. White & Case, Allen & Overy, Latham & Watkins, DLA Piper, all of these firms are big law firms that want a piece of that $1.8 trillion. And then you have, of course, some lawyers who are Muslims and motivated by wanting to really produce Sharia-compliant work. And then you have regulators. And by regulators, I mean government regulators, okay, who must interface with this industry. Is a bank in the United States permitted to, sell something that they call a Sharia-compliant home mortgage or not? You have to satisfy local law and your local regulators. So there's that interface as well. And that could be Muslim participants, and it could be absolutely not. Okay? So very briefly, I'm going to walk you through a couple of the major structures. Murabaha is a sale at cost plus, including, as I've written up here, by mu'ajjal, by salam istisna. These are different variations on what these types of contracts are. But basically, they're the type of contract where I say, okay, I bought this water bottle for $1.50, and now I'm going to sell it to Nora for $2.50. Okay? I just bought it, but I'm going to sell it to you for that markup. And that's murabaha. Now, if it's a by mu'ajjal structure, you get to pay me over time. Okay? That's not prohibited in the modern Islamic finance industry. So you can have deferred payments, right, that mimic the economics of a loan with interest. But the legal indices are distinct, and that's what makes Sharia scholars agree, the ones who do agree, that these are Sharia compliant. By salam is a forward sale. I'll give you, whatever it is now, and you'll give me the money later. Istisna is something where you're buying something for commission. Ijara is similar to leasing. Musharaka is a type of partnership. Mudaraba is like a limited partnership with profit and loss sharing. The kaful is similar to insurance, and sukuk is something we'll talk more about because that's similar to bonds and kind of the big story. So murabaha, again, is a sales contract at cost plus markup. The ownership is necessary for a valid sale. Possession is required. Let me skip ahead a little bit here to give you an example of what that might seem like here in Chicago, okay? Instead of being as theoretical, let's talk about a real situation. Does anybody here own a home? A few of you, okay, we own a home, right? So if you borrow, if you save your money and buy a home, good for you. You're all set, right? No question that's Sharia compliant. But what if you want to buy a house, take out a mortgage, a loan from a bank and a mortgage? Well, that's got interest. So now you're bumping up against that issue of riba, right? Well, I'm not really comfortable doing that. What do I do instead? Okay, so as an example, Devon Bank, and there are others, but Devon Bank was a pioneer nationally, and certainly here in Chicago. There's also Guidance Financial and others who sell these types of mortgages which do not bear interest. Okay, so how does one do that? Well, usually if you go and take out a mortgage, I buy the property from Nora, right? Now it's my property. But in order to pay her, I go and I take out a loan from you, right? And then I have to pay you back. You never own the property. You just give me the financing and I own the property. The difference in this structure is that the home seller, Nora, actually sells the property to the bank, right? And then the bank turns around and sells it to me, the homeowner, okay? And I then have to pay the bank over time, okay? So again, it mimics, say that the home price is $100,000, And at the end of a conventional 30-year mortgage, I'm going to end up paying the bank $300,000. Okay? So in this structure instead, she tells me, hey, you know, we're Muslims. I'll sell it to you without interest. I say, great, what's the purchase price, $100,000? And she says, no, $300,000 is what I'm going to sell it for. And so she sells it to the bank for $100,000. He sells it to me for $300,000. And then I pay him over time. Does that make sense? Is that pretty clear? Okay. Now the economics of that are basically identical to a conventional lease, but the law of that is distinct. It's actual ownership that's passing. Okay? And then what I would pay back, depending on whether or not that's a murabaha structure, remember that I sold her my water bottle for a markup, or whether it's an ijara, a lease, would be that I'm paying over time either installments of the purchase price or rental payments. Right? One or the other, but it's over time. So there are a few issues with this structure. Even if you feel that, well, the economic substance is the same, so that doesn't seem Sharia compliant to me, there are wrenches sort of in that. If you think, well, no, I don't care about that. The Sharia scholars have signed off on that. There is a distinction in the purchase and sale versus the lending with interest. There are still issues in terms of the law in the United States. Remember I said this is the dual regulatory systems that you have to think about. Well, if you transfer a property here in Illinois, okay, you have to pay tax to the government. So in the conventional setting, she sells it to me, there's one transfer of title, and I pay the government, you know, my one tax. In a Sharia compliant structure, you know, in this model, she sells it to him, tax, he sells it to me, oops, double tax. So that's not fair, right? But that's one of the issues. Another issue here is in the chain of title, okay? When you purchase something, you become liable for whatever environmental issues there might be on the property, okay? So now all of a sudden the bank is in the chain of title. If there's an environmental, what if there's a leak underneath, right? He's liable for that now. Well, banks don't want to be part of that. So that's an issue. Other issues have to do with the way that interest-based incentives are used in taxation, okay? So that, for example, when you fill out your income tax, if you're a homeowner, you have certain tax breaks based on the payment of interest to a bank. Well, if you've done the structure where it's a sale and there's no interest, you lose that. So suddenly you've disadvantaged the Muslim community that wishes to participate in these financings without interest. So the solution to that has been some rulings that the government has come down with, where the government, for the purposes of taxation, income tax and so on, says that, you know, this is really substance over form, form over substance, something called the economic substance doctrine. So they've said, you know, Muslims who wish to participate in this type of financing can still deduct those payments as interest on their income tax. And what the banks do is they leave it up to the individual homeowner. So now you, as the individual who's trying to be in the world in a way that is in accordance with the Sharia, you have to decide, are you going to take the financial incentive or are you not going to take the financial incentive? For purposes of the bank, it's, you know, not interest. For purposes of the US government, it is, if you take that deduction. Okay? There's also a prohibition in US law on a bank owning property. So that too is something that the OCC has ruled, well, it's okay. You know, we'll let the banks do that. So the US government has sort of a mixed response to Islamic finance. Some of the things that they'll do are, you know, helpful and facilitative, but there are lots of things that they don't do because of the political climate where there's all of this Islamophobia in the US political scene. So, for example, in the sukuk that we were talking about a few minutes ago, you have these sukuk here, the London sukuk. In order to issue those bonds, the government in the UK had to change its regulatory environment. There are certain restrictions on selling bonds and so on that had to be accommodated. So instead of things being interest-based in the law, they wrote into the law that it was okay to have alternative financings and that you could talk about profit rates, alternative profit rates, and so on. So these are participative financings, okay? Let's walk through one of these sukuk. Okay, this is the Qatar sovereign sukuk, and the difference between sovereign versus not sovereign. You can have governments that issue these sukuk. Again, they're similar to bonds, not exactly the same, but similar. And you can have companies that issue sukuk. So, for example, MR malls, right there, or the Emirates Airlines would issue a sukuk, get financing, use the financing for their corporate purposes. But you also had examples where it's the government itself issuing these sukuk. So in this particular example, this is from 2012, you had an ijara-based sukuk, where you have the land underneath the airport that is the subject of the sukuk. One of the important features of this is the choice of law provisions. They said, and this will be, if there's a dispute, subject to English law. Okay? So, very quickly, right, and this, if it's complicated, don't worry, we can walk through it. But you have in the middle here, you have this entity that is created just for this transaction. And you have this entity say, it's a corporate entity that is created by the government of Qatar, the state of Qatar. And it issues sukuk. And a bunch of investors down there at the bottom become these certificate holders. They give their money, okay, to invest in this. And they give their issuance proceeds, the $4 billion worth, to that entity, who then takes those proceeds and uses it to buy the land underneath the airport from the state of Qatar. With me so far, right? Okay, so Qatar sells the land, and the special purpose entity in the middle gives those proceeds as a pass-through from the investors. And then that entity in the middle turns around and leases the land back to the state of Qatar over time. You see? And so the lease payments, the rent payments over a period of years are how the money then gets back to the certificate holders with a profit. Okay? Clear as mud, right? So that is an economic structure that, again, mimics, from an economic point of view, a conventional bond deal, right? You get a profit at the end of the day, and the profits are often benchmarked against, and this used to be very problematic, benchmarked against, how do you decide how much profit there should be? They would benchmark it against an interest rate that's called LIBOR, the London Interbank Offering Rate. So people thought that was a problem. So again, you're talking about a lot of money. What happens when it goes wrong? Okay. Since I've only got a couple more minutes, let's talk about dispute resolution and some of those challenges. In terms of dispute resolution, so usually you're talking about, in finance, a situation where one party is supposed to pay another party and they don't, right? So what happens in that situation? There are two important principles, Sharia principles, that come into play here. And one is the concern with the relief of obligations when there's hardship. Okay, this is text-based. The text encourages delay until a time of ease. Oh, you know what? You can't pay me now. That's okay. Pay me when you can. Okay. Well, that has to be balanced against the fact that it is a sacred obligation to fulfill your pledges and covenants when you can. So you can't just say, oh, brother, you know, I'm having hardship now. I don't really want to pay back that $49 million that I owe you. You know, that's not okay. If you have the money and you're scamming your brother, that's not acceptable. So those are that's the tension between those principles. And I'll just walk you through a couple of quick cases that illustrate these principles. Shamil Bank was a Bahraini Islamic bank that got into a dispute with Bex & Co. Pharmaceuticals, which was a Bangladeshi company that was selling pharmaceuticals. It was a $49 million dispute. And Bex & Co. couldn't pay. They delayed their payments. They restructured a few times. They still weren't paying, so they ended up in court. Where? London, of course. That's where the Bahraini company with the Bangladeshi company naturally would be, right? Resolving the dispute. So the contract stated, subject to the principles of the glorious Sharia, this agreement shall be governed by and construed in accordance with the laws of England. Okay. So you had this very peculiar situation where a judge in London is supposed to decide whether or not Bex & Co. really has to pay the $49 million or not. Bex & Co. argued that, well, we shouldn't have to pay it because, you know, that structure that I just kind of walked you through, that wasn't really Sharia compliant, okay? So it's not enforceable, haha, right? And, you know, that really was a very difficult thing to decide. And what the court said was, oh, no, I'm not touching that. They had experts to say it is Sharia compliant, it is not Sharia compliant. You know, they had Sharia scholars that came in on both sides of that question. You know, this is just a sham, it's a ruse. Hiyal is the term for that, the legal term for that. And so the court decided this is so unjust. We are going to require that Bex & Co. Pay, and that, you know, it is not for a secular court to determine what is or is not Sharia compliant. Okay. In Dubai, there was, and this is actually something that I would like you all to understand, there is typically a mix of these types of financings in the Middle East, in the Gulf. For example, you have conventional banks that end up having an Islamic window. So they're doing both. They're not necessarily just Islamic financial institutions. They are conventional banks that also sell these products, like the home mortgages and so on, in these types of structures. And it's the same thing with sukuk. So you had in Dubai a variety of property developers, companies that were ultimately owned by the state. And there was approximately $101 billion of debt, most of which was conventional debt. But some of which, you know, nothing to sneeze at, $3.5 billion of the sukuk had to be restructured because they couldn't pay on time. And this was an example where it was all, again, within Dubai. Abu Dhabi ended up bailing out Dubai, and that was somewhere between 10 and 20 billion. It's a few billion here and there, right? And the way that was adjudicated was that the Emir of Dubai, thank you, created a special tribunal just for this purpose, to adjudicate these disputes. And that has gone through its own process. Those judges, I thought this was fascinating, the judges that were appointed to this tribunal were all Western trained. Okay? So you had, you know, a retired judge from the UK, somebody from, you know, New Zealand or something. One person was from Singapore. That was as close as you got to having somebody who was Muslim. So these disputes are not being adjudicated by people whose primary concern is Sharia compliance. I just think that's worth pointing out. Okay, so I'm pretty much out of time. Just one more quick example that I think is useful to understand. This just came up. This was a $7.5 billion bankruptcy that was filed in New York Our capita bank was is still a Bahraini Islamic investment firm, and they had $1.1 billion that they needed to refinance and couldn't because of the market turned down. And so this was actually adjudicated in a bankruptcy court in New York. So again, the choice of law here, this was a big bankruptcy. The judge in this case said, wow, I can't really decide Sharia compliance or not Sharia compliance, but this is fascinating. I never knew any of this. And they did come up with a reorganization plan that continued to use Sharia compliant structures. And this was the first time that has ever been the case. That was in 2013, so very recent. Goldman Sachs was a huge participant in that. That also has a happy ending with asset sales and a new Sharia compliant financing for $550 million that brought the company back to profitability. Okay, so a couple of resources if you have any interest. IOFI is an organization based in Bahrain that creates these standards to try and harmonize Sharia interpretation. A similar group is in Malaysia. They are now cooperating and collaborating much more than they used to. And then a couple of oops, how did that happen? A couple of other resources that can give you more information if you want. Websites.
Did I see Chicago on one of the slides?
You did see Chicago, and what I was quickly trying to breeze through was that there is Islamic finance participation here in Chicago. There are examples of people who want to talk about that.
Okay, well then, should
Yeah.
we take some questions
Yeah,
now? We
absolutely.
can pass around the microphone.
Yeah.
Does anyone have a question? Okay.
I've never heard of the word sukuk before. I mean, I've been a Muslim most of my life. I think everybody can hear me here. The question I had is, the whole 2008, the collapse of financial conventional capitalism, did that have an effect on this, resurgence of Islamic finance? And the other question I had, I was kind of taking the notes here, is there like a governing body that determines which financial products are Sharia compliant? Such as we have halal food, right? So we know what is halal, what is not. So is there like a body that determines that, and is there like education going on for the newer generation? Because as the Pew search shows, 2015, people who identify themselves as Muslims, are going to outnumber any other religious affiliation. So there's going to be a huge buying power. There's going to be a lot of consumers looking for Sharia compliant or something that aligns with their religious values. So how are we training the younger generation on becoming aware of these financial practices that are Islamic?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's take those one.
Yeah, sorry, I kind of laid it out there.
Yeah, absolutely. So the word sukuk, if you've not heard of it before, it's the plural for certificates, sak, right? And what that means is that you are purchasing an equity investment. You are purchasing a portion of that underlying asset. So if it's a company who's got a factory that's making air conditioning, for example, that was sukuk a few years back, right? You have purchased part of that asset. Okay, if you're talking about the land underlying Doha Airport, right? You have now purchased a number of certificates that represent an underlying ownership interest in that asset itself. Okay, that's what sukuk means. Certificates. Okay. The next question was.
Is there a governing body?
Yeah, a governing body,
Yeah.
right. So you have several types of conferences, right, where Sharia scholars come together and debate these various things. Now, none of that, of course, I'm sure that you know and understand, is binding, right? All of that ijtihad that is done to determine whether something is Sharia compliant or not Sharia compliant is the work of those individual scholars. So this is actually, I think, a very interesting aspect of the Islamic finance industry, is that it has sort of led to this trending of group ijtihad. So you don't have ijma, consensus, but you have a lot more sort of discussion and collaboration of scholars together to try and come up with rulings that would be consistent. Now, what you have in the industry itself is that virtually every Islamic financial institution has its own Sharia board, right? And there aren't that many scholars who are both well-versed in ijtihad and also in modern economics. Those are not two things that have previously gone together very well. You have a new generation, though, that is coming up and is studying, getting certificates in Islamic finance, studying this in different programs throughout both the Middle East and in Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on. So you have more of that. But again, none of this is binding, right? It really does depend on individual Muslims. Do you respect that scholar enough? There's also a lot of overlap. There are certain scholars, Taqi Uthmani being an example that we had just been talking about, who sit on numerous Sharia boards, like 80 boards or something, and they're paid for that work. So that's another thing that, again, people have to determine for themselves. Is this really Sharia compliant? Yeah, next.
Sorry, I think he had a question already. Sorry, thank you.
Go ahead over there.
Was there a third? Oh yeah, the education side.
I noticed basically most of the Islamic banks heavily based on murabah. I think murabah looked like the easy money. The banks that just want to provide to their stakeholders, because as far as I know, in Syria, the Islamic financing started in the early 2000s. But basically, most of the operations they do is the murabah thing. They just want to have easy money, for profits for their stakeholders. There's less focusing on other means of Islamic financing, like mubaraba, like ijara, something like that. My question is how these Islamic banks are participating in the growth process, the economic growth of at least Islamic countries, or is that related to the economic structures of the Islamic countries as well?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, because of course the underlying principles are all about ethics, right? But there is a difference between what's commonly referred to as Islamic economics, theories, macroeconomic theories. How is this going to impact development? How is this going to be good for the Muslim community? Versus, the Islamic finance industry itself, which may be doing primarily murabaha, right? And in certain locations maybe is simply doing murabaha because it is more profitable. But one of the issues that you have to keep in mind here is that from the scholar's perspective, you are being asked what is lawful and what is unlawful. So you can't, and we get that all the time as lawyers practicing law, right? It could be that my client comes to me with something that I think is a really bad idea, right? But it's not illegal. I can't tell them that it is illegal. And then it's up to them, the practitioners, to decide, is that worthwhile or not? So you have a lot of diversity. Just because something is marketed as an Islamic product or a Sharia compliant product doesn't mean it's all about what's good for the community, good for economic development. One thing though to look at is the IDB, the Islamic Development Bank, who does certainly try to have transactions that will have an impact on development. Another place of overlap that is really just starting is the idea of impact investing or socially responsible investing. There's a lot of sort of commonality with some of the Islamic finance industry things. Next question.
Assalamu alaikum. Great presentation, which is no surprise. I don't have a question, I have a comment. It's a very bold statement, so I have to preface it a little bit. I had a chance to work with the Nobel laureate, who's also considered one of the fathers of modern finance, during my MBA days to research Islamic banking and finance. We have dropped the word banking because in the US, these institutions are not allowed to use the word bank.
Right.
So I investigated that, then I studied every financial instrument that I thought of, the credit cards in Malaysia, the securitization in Zurich, and so on and so forth, talked to the bankers in London, and Goldman Sachs. It's nothing new. Goldman Sachs have been involved with Islamic products since 1980s and 90s. At the end of it, I came to the conclusion that there is no such thing as Islamic finance. I have a great deal of respect. I have lots of friends and practitioners who are working for Guidance Financial and others, Islamic financial products. The book that was mentioned in your introduction is written by a good friend of ours, Karen Hunt Ahmed, in Chicago. But then, as an ordinary Muslim, I felt the obligation to do something. So this is what I did after talking to a number of scholars. I made a vow, and I want to repeat that here so that you can bear witness to, that on the Day of Judgment, and we Muslims believe in that, on the Day of Judgment, I'm going to drag these Sharia board ulama, scholars, and demand justice, because a lot of them didn't listen to me, didn't want to have discussions. Some of them threatened fatwa against me. When my father-in-law heard that threat, he said, if there is a fatwa, I cannot have my daughter married to you, I'll take my daughter and your kids away. So it became very personal. So yeah, I'm keeping it short. Do you want to have a discussion, sir? No, so I'm just saying that this is very pertinent. So that's my point. Nothing against practitioners. They are doing a wonderful job. If I had a job, I would probably be doing something similar. But at the same time, we Muslims have this tendency that once the word Islamic is slapped in front of something, then we cannot argue with that. We cannot debate that. And that voice needs to be heard too. That argument needs to be discussed in our discourses. That's it.
So to respond to that, I guess I would just like to point out that when you put the name Islamic in front of something, that does not automatically make it actually Islamic. And so a big part of this industry relies on the marketing. You know, why is it called ijara when really it's a lease? You know, there is definitely an aspect of the industry that is very savvy with respect to marketing. That doesn't mean that it is actually Islamic or not Islamic. That is for the individual Muslim to decide, okay? And that's part of, you know, the pluralistic tradition of Islam, where you have multiple schools of law that are mutually respectful, although you're disagreeing. So the thing that I think is really important to remember in the Islamic finance industry is that if you don't agree that it is actually Sharia compliant, you simply don't purchase those products, right? Other questions?
Ladies first. Hi. So I'll be honest that I read about all this just 3 years ago, because I'm not a Muslim. I didn't know this, but I really wanted to know more about it. So my question is, for most of the people here who've been in Chicago or in America for so many years now, how does it become possible for you all to really, you know, be compliant to the Sharia laws, which might be difficult here as compared to in the Middle East or the Gulf countries, where everybody is following a set way of doing these things, or, you know, managing finances. But here people do it differently, and as you said, that they're normally, because it's a dual system, you have to like be compliant with the banks here and also with the Sharia. So I just wanted to know more about this.
Okay, so I think it's very important to address there's an underlying assumption in what you're saying, that in, for example, the Gulf, you know, everybody is acting in accordance with Sharia. That's not true, okay? Not only is that not true with respect to individuals, right, but the governmental systems, the systems of law, are not necessarily oriented towards the Sharia. In the aftermath of colonialism, okay, laws in the Gulf are based on the Napoleonic Code, they're based on British law. And then you have special accommodations that facilitate and enable the Islamic finance industry as it is currently developed. But there is no question that predominantly Muslim countries are integrated into the global economy in ways that are, very enmeshed, right? It's not true that the government, I was just giving a couple of examples, for example, Dubai, right, where you had $101 billion of debt, the vast majority of which was not in Sharia-compliant vehicles. Whether, begging the question of whether or not you think they're actually Sharia-compliant, they're not even trying to be Sharia-compliant. They're interest-based, okay? So then taking it back to your question about, well, what do you do, if you're a Muslim here in Chicago and so on. If you agree that these products are actually Sharia compliant, you can go to Guidance or Devon Bank and purchase those products for financing your business or financing your home, financing your car. And if you don't think those things are Sharia compliant, but you are a devout Muslim and you don't want to participate in interest or other kinds of financings, you can just save your money and purchase it, whatever it is that you want to purchase. Your equipment financing, open your store, open the building that you want. There is nothing that compels you to go out and take out interest-bearing debt.
Crowdfunding.
Huh?
Crowdfunding.
Crowdfunding, equity participation. You and a bunch of your friends come together and you each put in, your own equity amount, and then you open your business. You save your money and then you buy your house instead of buy your house and then pay.
Or don't buy a house, just rent all your life.
Or you can rent.
So.
Sure.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, it's okay. One more question, and then I think we'll conclude.
Thank you. The question I had for you was, are there any resources that you could recommend to examine what the growth has been in certain countries for Islamic finance, or what the growth has been as far as different types of firms? Like, have we seen more of an emergence of social impact investment firms as opposed to banks offering traditional mortgages? Because I would be interested to see where this industry is headed.
Yeah, that's a great question. These are the resources that I wasn't showing correctly a few minutes ago. But, there's nothing that I can say right here. These are the statistics and the empirical data that's all been collected and monitored perfectly. Okay, this is so new. It's only really a couple decades that you're talking about. And so it's difficult to get rigorous analytical, empirical data on all of those things. There are some spots where there's data. The IDB puts out reports, the Islamic Development Bank. The IFSB, International Financial Services Board Stability Report, is one. And then there have been these up at the beginning where I talked about these other reports. And again, in terms of data, Deutsche Bank had a report in 2011. Standard & Poor's had a report. Ernst & Young had a report in 2013. But they all have slightly different estimates and slightly different numbers. And so, again, I can't really tell you, oh yes, this is the definitive, rigorous methodology for analytical data.
Thank you.
And Dr. Shawamreh, before we conclude, we have a small token of appreciation. I think Dr. Omar Awas would like to present it on behalf of American Islamic College. Thank you very much. It's Ebru, it's a Turkish form of art, and I'm sure one of us, Dr. Ali, your Saver, can maybe even describe it more for you.
That is so nice. Thank you very much.
You're so welcome. Thank you. Yeah, well, thank you all so much for coming. Don't forget to hashtag again IIC lecture, and we have plenty of events coming up, and we're going to stay a little bit longer to talk with Dr. Cynthia. So thank you again. Safe travels back home. Good night.
Would you like to say something?
Oh, excuse me.
I guess I have to, in a shameless act of self-promotion,
I have to. There is the course that I'm offering over the winter break on the more so on the ethics and the norms and legal aspects of Islamic finance. There will be elements of the things, at least in the reading, the elements of the industry as well, but the focus of the course on the ethics and how these things are structured in the contemporary setting. So if you're interested in a one-week crash course, it is a semester course, and therefore it is squeezed into 1 week. So it's 5 days, 9 to 6 p.m. to cover all of the hours of the semester. And the way it functions is that you would register for the course early. You would have to do some work before you come to the course. And during the 1 week course, you will have to do some work there. And there may be an opportunity also to do some work afterwards, so we can get, you know, a full 3-credit course that is a graduate course on Islamic finance.
You can take it either with credit or without credit. If it is for credit, it is $750. If it is non-credit, then it is $375 auditing. Okay.
Right. And if you have any questions, I'll be around.
Okay. Thank you very much.
That was not a shame. My question.